Okay, so when you're coming into the Overeaters Anonymous program, you're going to hear a lot of talk about whether or not to use a sponsor. Well, you're going to be probably strongly encouraged to use a sponsor. So I want to give you a little bit of information about that, and I want to give you some guidance on how to choose one if you decide to use one. And I also want to explain to you why you may not decide to use one. So first of all, excuse me, I want to tell you that I have a lot of big opinions about sponsors. You'll probably find other links on this video, on this YouTube channel. I have talked about sponsors, just some things to keep in mind about them. One thing to be very, very careful of is to recognize that not all sponsors are created equal. So my first advice to you, if you do decide to use a sponsor, is to be prayerful about trying to find the right person to use. Because when I say not all sponsors are created equal, I mean that you'll find that each sponsor does things a little bit different. So the idea is that you find someone who has what you want, and then you ask them to work with you. And when they work with you, they're going to give you the program as they worked it. So they'll tell you what to do based on how they've done it. So that's good because they can kind of give you a formula to follow, but also there's a little bit of danger there. And let me explain why. So the 12 steps of addiction recovery are pretty straightforward and pretty easy to follow. They're beautiful and lovely and simple. Now, somebody who's coming through the program who's working the 12 steps might also choose to use the tools. That's going to be in another video. I'll do that in the next video. But the tools are different than the steps. The tools are optional things that someone might choose to do. For instance, using a sponsor, or going to meetings, or making phone calls to outreach to try to stay connected to people. Or maybe they would have a plan of abstinence. There's a lot of different things that people might choose to use as additional tools as part of their program of recovery. In addition to that, sponsors might add their own things that they would ask you to do. So now you're looking at the possibility of working with a sponsor who will give you the 12 steps of addiction recovery as a guideline, but also they might add tools and say, hey, these also actually are required. And then they might also say, and hey, actually, I'm also going to ask you to do these things because that's how I did it, because that's how my sponsor told me to do it. So the problem that I kind of have with that model is this. The 12 steps of addiction recovery are enough. They are great. Now, the tools might be beneficial to you. Use whatever works for you, the ones that you like, but it's really important to know that they are optional and that the steps of addiction recovery are enough. So the problem comes in when people say, you have to do these 12 steps, plus you have to do these tools, plus you have to go to 90 meetings in 90 days, plus you have to read an hour a day from the big book. They might add in all of these other things. And when they're describing that to somebody who's coming into the program new, the person who's new doesn't understand that those aren't all requirements in order to recover. So the 12 steps are simple, and you can follow them. You can complete them in a matter of weeks. You can see a link below for a video on exactly how long it takes. But when you add in these other things, somebody who's coming in new, they might feel really overwhelmed and they think, wow, I got to do the 12 steps plus all those tools, plus go to 90 meetings in 90 days, plus read all this stuff. And now all of a sudden they feel exhausted before they've even begun. Maybe they're desperate enough to try and do all of those things, but how long are you going to be able to keep it up? Well, there are a few people who do. They do it, and then they find recovery, and then they're not exactly sure how they found it, but they know they went to 90 meetings in 90 days and did all the tools, and they did all the 12 steps. And so now they're ready, they're recovered, and they're ready to teach it to someone else, and then they're going to teach the next person all those things. You have to do all those things. And I think there's just a lot of the game of telephone affecting how sponsors are teaching the program and how people are doing the program. And when you pack on so many things of things that you have to do and you think they're all required, it can become really discouraging and exhausting, and I think it kind of sets people up for failure. So if you do choose to use a sponsor, be very, very careful to make sure that you have done your work to make sure you know what the 12 steps are. And if a sponsor is asking you to use a tool, just recognize, just be sensitive to the fact that these are optional suggestions, and maybe that sponsor isn't going to be the best fit for you because maybe you don't want to use some of the tools that they are suggesting. Maybe you're willing to and you want to try and you want to do it how they've done it, but either way, it's really important to know what the 12 steps are, and I will talk about those specifically in another video. So if you're going to do to use a sponsor. Be prayerful about who to find. I also suggest specifically working with a big book sponsor. That's totally up to you though. I mean, rule number one, pray to find the right sponsor, and hopefully you'll be led to the person that's been prepared for you specifically. Everything that I'm going to say next are just my opinions. But I prefer using a big book sponsor, meaning they work with the text of Alcoholics Anonymous first before they work with the text of Overeaters Anonymous, because they feel strongly that, hey, the steps are enough. The 12 steps of addiction recovery are enough, so let's not add on some of these other things like a food plan. And so they're going to specifically work with trying to get you in the space of figuring out your spiritual health by using the 12 steps of addiction recovery and not focusing so much on trying to wrestle the food. I have talked more about that in another video, which is also really, really important. Because I just think that working exclusively on the steps is really going to help set you up for success, because it's a lot easier to do 12 steps than it is to do a whole list of all of these other things and tools and trying to fight your food and work a diet and all of those things at the same time. It just puts your focus and your energy and makes the program seem super, super overcomplicated. The other thing I would be very cautious of is if you choose to use a sponsor, be sure to try to find somebody who is actually recovered. So come up with a few questions that you want to ask. One question that I could definitely recommend is ask them how long they have been neutral towards their food. Ask them if they are neutral towards their food. Ask them if they're still struggling with like cravings on a daily basis. Ask them those kinds of questions, if they've made peace with food, because that's really what you want. You don't necessarily want to be in a place where you can just control your food and just white knuckle your way through cravings. Like, recovery promises that those things can be removed from you. And so ask them those kinds of questions, because some sponsors, unfortunately, some sponsors lie. They say they are recovered when they're not recovered. Now, I'm not trying to scare you away from using a sponsor. Like I said, pray, and I'm sure your higher power will help you figure it out and find the right person who has what you want and who can give you the mentorship that you're looking for. But some sponsors do lie. They mean well. The reason they do that, unfortunately, is because there's a misunderstanding that step 12 is to sponsor people. It isn't, but there is a misunderstanding that that is the case. So that kind of makes a circular problem where people think, oh, I can't recover unless I do all 12 steps. But I can't do step 12, which is sponsor, unless I've recovered. But I can't recover unless I've done all 12 steps. So it kind of creates this circular problem. So they'll say they recovered so that they can sponsor, but they haven't recovered, and so they are sponsoring when they probably shouldn't be sponsoring. And it's really awful, because this program is really about trying to let go of selfishness and let go of dishonesty and fear and resentment and all of those things. And so if you're lying in order to get something out of someone, then you are being dishonest for selfish reasons. And so that the person who lies in order to sponsor probably is not someone who will ever find recovery, honestly. And that's not the person you want trying to lead you through your own program of recovery when they're still stuck. The other danger there is that if this is someone who isn't recovered, they probably are still locked in a lot of pain and fear and resentment and control in their life. And so they're not going to bring a really healthy dynamic into that relationship. So if they are someone who's made peace with food, then that's someone you can see. If they've made peace with food, they've probably made peace in their life, peace with their higher power, and they can teach you how to get there. This isn't just about trying to white knuckle your way through food or food cravings. That's not what this journey is about. You want to get to the other side where it's lifted from you completely and you have peace. And so don't work with someone who's in the middle of a fight with their food, because they will just show you how to fight with your food for the rest of your life, and that's really uncomfortable. And so those are the guidelines that I suggest for finding a sponsor. I hope that's helpful. And again, you might choose to not use a sponsor. I'm no longer using one. I have not used one now for a few years, or I guess just about a couple years now. And I did use one, though. I did use one. I used 4 different sponsors over the course of about 18 months when I was coming in. And I'm very grateful to the women who served me and who helped me. It helped me to establish some accountability. I'm especially grateful that it was 4 different people over time, only because that did teach me that, wow, every sponsor is going to do things a little bit different. And so when I started to sponsor, that taught me that, like, well, I can't just do it how my sponsor did it, because they all did it different. I want to make sure I'm doing it right. So I went back to the AA book, the Alcoholics Anonymous book, to read it, to really study it, to figure out like how do I sponsor. And what I realized was that's when I learned that step 12 is not sponsoring. Actually, the word sponsor isn't even in the original text of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's not there. So it wasn't designed to be the way it is now, where you go into a program and you find someone to adopt you and mentor you through the program every single day, having that relationship. That is not what it was designed to be at all. And so that, if you want to know more about what it was designed to be, I suggest you read it. Just go back and read it. Read the Alcoholics Anonymous book. There are 3 chapters specifically focused on the steps and how to work them. Like I said, I'll talk about that more specifically in another video. But this, like sponsorship, I'll say, that is covered in chapter 7, and it's called Working with Others. That is step 12, and as you read it, you'll see, it's not supposed to be the way that people are doing it today. And again, I'm not trying to discourage you from having a sponsor, but I just want you to know that there are other ways to work the program. You don't really have to do it with a sponsor. It is important to understand the program and know how to do it, but I'm trying to give you a lot of resources here that will help you get started. And you might opt to use a sponsor. That's fine. Be prayerful, and you will find the resources that will best serve you, and the relationships that will best serve you. I worked with 4 different sponsors, and I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for the experience I had of just becoming more accountable for the daily choices I was making. Not with food. I didn't work with food sponsors. So I didn't have someone policing me and looking over my shoulder and saying, what did you eat? Did you eat sugar? I did, however, have people expecting me to text them about my step work, like the step work I was doing to work on the 12 steps. And so that was really helpful for me to maintain that accountability, and that helped me get in the habit of doing the step works. The steps work. I'm saying it funny. So the step work, there we go. Anyway, and so, but what happened for me is, each of those relationships, for one reason or another, they ended. And there wasn't drama. My first sponsor, she and I just had scheduling conflicts. My next sponsor, she ended up moving into another fellowship. My next sponsor, she actually decided to not work with me anymore because she wanted to spend more time on her food plan and her food prep and didn't have time to sponsor. And so, and then my last sponsor I worked with for about 6 months, and that relationship ended because I knew that I just wasn't interested in working with a sponsor anymore. And but I'm grateful that I worked with 4 different women, because again, it did show me the diversity between women and between the sponsors and how they work the program. I'd also worked with a couple sponsors in the past when I first came into the program over 15 years ago. And they all did things really different. And what I learned, though, this last time, as I worked with these 4 women in that period of 18 months, I felt like I was not having a conversation with 4 different people. I felt like it was one progressive conversation I was having with my higher power with each of these 4 women. So I kind of felt like I was prayerful in the beginning to find my right sponsor. And the woman that I ended up being paired with, she was the one who described to me how I could use just the 12 steps. I didn't have to have a food plan, that I didn't have to cut sugar out for the rest of my life. And so she kind of plugged me into the big book way of doing things, of using the 12 steps of recovery and not, adding all these other things. So I'm grateful for that. And we had a scheduling conflict, so I moved on, and that next sponsor, she really taught me about the grace that God gives to me, this opportunity to try again. Because I remember the first time I ate a carton of ice cream within 24 hours, even though she wasn't a food sponsor, and looking over my shoulder, I felt like that's probably something I should tell her. And I was worried that I was going to tell her, and then she was going to dump me. I did tell her, and she didn't dump me. She just said, sounds like you probably need to be spending a little more time with God today, so make sure that you do that. And that was for me, a big aha moment, because I was like, oh yeah, my God does give me grace. My God does allow for second chances, and he's not trying to shame me. Every time I make a mistake, he's trying to encourage me to try again. And so, that was a wonderful relationship I had with that sponsor. And then the next sponsor, that one, she and I worked together for about 6 weeks. I was doing a food plan with her, actually, because I was thinking I needed something more. That was not the case. That was another misunderstanding of the program at the time. But in that relationship, actually what I learned was that I was using my sponsor as my higher power. Because when our relationship ended after 6 weeks, I felt so abandoned and so angry, and I was confused. And then I started binging again, because I'm like, well, my sponsor isn't around to look at what I'm doing, so I can just do whatever I want. And that's when I realized, like, oh, I have messed this up. I'm using her as my higher power. This isn't about being accountable to a human. This is about me trying to be accountable to my higher power. And then my last sponsor, again, I learned a lot through that period of time, and I just am grateful. I feel like I had one long dialogue with my higher power over the space of 4 different women who each contributed to that conversation in a different way. And I think that was able to happen for me because I always was trying to be so prayerful about finding the right sponsor. And so what ended up happening is God didn't attach me to a sponsor that was like my end-all be-all person to take me through the journey. What he ended up showing me over time really was that this was a journey I was taking with him. I was trying to find a human to take me through that I could get attached to, but it was him. It was always him. And so through that experience, I just was able to better understand what the point is of the program and some of the dangers that we can run into when we are working with a sponsor. So hopefully some of my story will help you to avoid some of those pitfalls and to help guide you in choosing the right sponsor if you decide to use one. All right, thanks. And you can look below for maybe some other questions that you're trying to answer or just progress to the next video in this series. Thanks.